In the midst of World War II, scientists all over the world were called upon to enact experiments which would have seemed inhumane and just plain torture. A group of German Nazi scientists were called upon by the demanding Hitler himself, as Hitler was dreaming of being immortal. Hitler had thought to himself that if he was immortal, he would be seen as a god by his people. These scientists that took part in this experiment to find immortality are still unknown, and they would first have to experiment on a test subject, and if it proved successful, they would take away the test subject's immortality, and then kill him as ordered by Hitler. There were 5 scientists working on this immortality experiment, and they were some of the best scientists in the field at the time. The scientists knew they had no choice but to succeed or face the wrath of Hitler. The test subject was known, though. He was a British secret agent working for MI6 named Edward Cullingham, and he was caught by the Nazi Germans, and at the age of 30, he was chosen against his consent to be the test subject in this immortality experiment. The scientists were definitely ahead of their time and had knowledge not known by most people in their era. They were to test the liquid chemical substance they had formed, and this liquid chemical substance is still unknown in today's time as to what was in the liquid chemical they had used on Edward to make him immortal. When Edward was finally given this chemical liquid substance, the scientists observed him, and for the next 2 weeks, he would be shaking and breathing heavily, as if having trouble breathing. After 2 weeks, Edward was completely quiet, and showed less emotion than usual. The scientists were trying to converse with him, but Edward, with a weird look on his face, would sometimes reply to something else in the room, not visible to the eye, saying, "What are you doing?" The scientists couldn't understand what Edward was doing. He would talk to himself as if something else was there with him. But he would say things like, "I'm harmless. I am no harm to you." And would say other things like, "I'm a good person. Please don't do it." The scientists then wondered if Edward had gone crazy with the type of things he would say out loud to himself. They finally knew, though, that they had been successful at achieving immortality when they cut Edward's hands, and his hand would heal instantly with no scars. They celebrated and couldn't wait to tell Hitler, until Edward started to scream in pain and fear, shouting at something in the air to stop giving him pain. Edward would constantly shout out loud, saying things like, "I'm harmless. There's no need for this. Control your egos." The scientists stopped thinking Edward was crazy when they took a few pictures of Edward, and they had spotted other figures in the picture next to Edward, when those figures weren't seen before in the room. The scientists studied these creepy pictures and what the figures could be. Even though the figures looked fuzzy in the pictures, they could clearly see that some strange figures had horns and wings. They then decided that Edward isn't talking alone, and that they had now had a second piece of evidence that Edward was truly immortal. When you are immortal, you are like a god, and being like a god, you would attack the egos of other unworldly creatures who also think they are gods, or even who are truly gods themselves. And they would have the urge to challenge you and fight you, just like what they're doing to Edward. It explains why Edward was saying such things as, "Please leave me alone, I'm harmless, and I have no desire or intention that I think that I am better than you." And Edward would scream in pain, and until the scientists couldn't take the screams of Edward anymore, by constantly healing, but being constantly visited by other creatures, with their egos attacked, and so wanted to visit him, to show Edward that they are better than him. It's like in the playground. When you have a talent or some special skill, it attracts the bullies and the jealous types to your way to challenge you and get the better of you. Or even when you become a better opponent. You make other opponents and need to challenge and make sure of it that you shouldn't mess with them. But one of the scientists wanted to see further, as he was so intrigued as to what was happening to Edward, and so they allowed this to happen for a couple of more weeks. Edward was even visited by the prideful and extremely jealous Satan. Edward would shout out loud in pain, "Please, Satan, I mean no harm. I have no intentions or thoughts that I am better than you. Please stop." It didn't stop there for Edward, when until the Almighty God himself felt like challenging Edward, and Edward screamed in pain, shouting, "Please, God, no, God. Please, I'm harmless. I'm not better than you. Please, I'm in pain. Please stop." And then all the scientists thought to themselves that enough is enough, and they tried taking away Edward's immortality. But they quickly came to realize that you cannot reverse immortality. Edward screamed and cried for mercy, but none came to him. The scientists ordered that Edward be buried very deep under the ground, alive for eternity in pain in a coffin, as the scientists couldn't do anything to help Edward anymore. When Hitler heard of this, he decided mortality isn't so bad after all.